Oh, it says I'm live now. Okay.
Yeah, we're ready to go.
Okay. In Western esotericism, all secret knowledge has its roots in ancient Egypt. All the great sages had to be seen as having obtained some knowledge and some wisdom from Egypt. Pythagoras went to Egypt. Plato talks about his teacher Solon traveling to Egypt. Even Christianity felt obliged to send Jesus to Egypt as part of its mythos. So it's no surprise that Egypt plays a role in the founding days of the Theosophical Society. Its influence took the form of the Brotherhood of Luxor. And in this talk, I'll examine this sort of mysterious group known as the Brotherhood of Luxor, of what could have been its composites and its influence. By the time we get to Plato, it's kind of a given that true ancient knowledge began in Egypt. In his Timaeus, Plato tells us of Solon visiting Egypt for teaching knowledge that was unattainable in Greece. The Romans continued this tradition. Temples were established to Isis and Osiris throughout the Roman Empire. In his 2nd century classic Metamorphos, Epulus, his hero Lucius, discovers true magic when he is rescued by Isis and later initiated into the temple of Osiris. The tradition of Egypt as the cradle of all magical knowledge is continued through the hidden sciences of alchemy, albeit hidden under a repressive Christian and later Islamic regimes. As religious repression eased, the Renaissance saw a period. So the Renaissance saw Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary merger of the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth, emerge as the father of the Hermetic movement. Later, in the rise of Freemasonry, the term Egyptian became synonymous with esoteric, as in the Egyptian Freemasonry of Cagliostro. And with the Napoleonic incursions into Egypt, and the first modern scientific studies of Egypt began, which is highlighted by the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the founding of the science of Egyptology. Relatively few years later, by the time we get to Eliphas Levi, and he writes his opus, Dogma in High Magic, the tradition of ancient Egypt being rooted in the ancient wisdom being rooted in Egypt was and preserved in the works of the occultists is assumed by Western magicians, Freemasons, and occultists. Now, there's another academic argument for the Renaissance idea of traditional wisdom. And this begins in the West with the interest of Cosimo Medici. Cosimo was smitten with the classics and Neoplatonism after he came into contact with the works of Jamias Platon. So inspired, he commissioned Marcello Ficino to translate the classical Greek works into Latin. And he went on to try to recreate the Athenian school in Florence in 1445. Now, Jamias Platon was an interesting character. So during his time, while Christianized Neoplatonism was tolerated and enjoyed more of a continuation in the Byzantine Christian world, especially in the monastic hesychasm, Plathian pushed the envelope. He pushed it with his open embrace and even promotion of classical pagan ideas. As part of this promotion, Plathan saw himself as part of an unbroken chain of Platonic philosophers and initiates, going back to ancient Greece and hence to Egypt itself. Now, Theosophy takes a more straightforward take on the endurance of ancient wisdom. In the teaching of Theosophy, mankind, via individual souls, evolves. And part of this evolution, there's a group of mankind who have already evolved or ascended to a level of existence that allows them to maintain ancient wisdom, and in careful situations, to pass this wisdom down to the general population of mankind. The idea of the ascended masters became very popular in the mid-19th century. And be it ascended masters, council of chiefs, a great white brotherhood, whatever, the 19th century occultists promoted this idea of the evolved group of men bestowing initiation, dropping tidbits of wisdom, and planting seeds to steer humanity. So, what is this source of this powerful brotherhood? In the East, there's a long tradition of an ancient order of rishis whose mission is to be the guardians of humanity. So while this idea of eternal, or at least long-lived living masters has floated around Kabbalistic and alchemical circles, it had a public outing with the publication of the Rosicrucian Manifesto in 1614. And after this time, secret masters were rumored to be behind secret organizations. And it was in the spiritualist movement of the 19th century that these secret masters begin to overtly communicate with mediums. And these communications were often published as explanations or prophecies of the spirit world. So, what of the Brotherhood of Luxor? In Isis Unveiled, Blavatsky mentions this only once, but it's a tasty paragraph. Oh, well, it's really actually a footnote, but it's interesting and it's tickled the imagination of theosophical historians. And she writes, what will perhaps seem to astonish American readers is the fact that in the United States, a mystical fraternity now exists, which claims an intimate relationship with one of the oldest and most powerful of the Eastern Brotherhoods. It is known as the Brotherhood of Luxor, and its faithful members have the custodian of very important secrets of science. Its ramifications extend widely throughout the Republic of the West. Though this brotherhood has long and hard been at work, the secret of its existence has been jealously guarded. Mackenzie describes this as having a Rosicrucian basis and numbering many members. But in this, the author is mistaken. It has no Rosicrucian basis. The name Luxor is primarily associated with the ancient Belochistan city of Luxor and lies between Bela and Kegi, and also gave its name to the Egyptian city. Now, attempts by researchers to track down the source of Mackenzie's reference to the Brotherhoods of Luxor has come up short. The current consensus one of the current consensuses is that Mackenzie may have been inflating the name Luxor with that of Luxus, as in the Fractus Luxus, which was an English brotherhood established by Francis Irwin. Mackenzie also referred to the Brotherhood of Luxor as both American and Rosicrucian. And this sounds a lot like what eventually became the Hermetic Brotherhood of Light. However, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Light wasn't founded until 1884, after the Theosophical Society. Now, alternatively, Mackenzie could have been referring to another Rosicrucian work being held by a man named Paschal Beverly Randolph in Boston in the early 1860s. Paschal Beverly Randolph is an interesting character. He is born in New York in 1825, and that makes him a contemporary of Blavatsky, who was born in 1831. His mother died at an early age, leaving Randolph to make ends meet on the streets of New York. And during this time, he taught himself to read by using billboards and posters he saw along the city. As a teenager, he took a job as a sailor, crossing the Atlantic. And during this time, he recognized that he had an ability with foreign languages, as well as a passion for travel and excitement. And this, combined with his sort of psychic skills, took him in to visit a number of mystery schools during this time. Now, after returning from his travels overseas, Randolph used his psychic gifts to become part of the spiritualist movement in Northeast America. And in this, he discovered he also had quite the panache as an orator. Now, during the 1850s, the spiritualist movement in the United States was heavily entwined with that of the abolitionist movement. And being a Black man, Randolph quickly became the darling of these various spiritualist groups, speaking on both abolition as well as spiritualism. Using his psychic abilities, he wrote several books. He sold products such as magic mirrors and potions to enhance clairvoyance. And similar to Blavatsky, he had a revelation in the 1860s that spiritualism itself was on the wrong track, that spirits were not spirits of the dead, nor was the spirits of the dead a path to personal expansion. At this point, he became interested in organizations, and he began labeling himself as a Rosicrucian. He started the Fraternus Rosicrucis in Boston in 1856 that moved to San Francisco in 1861. The story of Randolph, like that of Blavatsky, is full of these wide travels to exotic man, meetings and initiations with strange esoteric teachers. He traveled at that time, talking about during like the 1840s, 1850s, included time in Egypt and the Middle East. And it's not really recorded whether or not he met Blavatsky, whether Blavatsky and Randolph physically met, but they were both in Paris at the same time in the 1850s, and they were traveling in similar occult circles. Now, Olcott, on the other hand, was familiar with the work of Randolph and had a number of his books, and possibly even had known the man in person. But even if Randolph and Blavatsky did not physically meet, they were acquainted with each other on the astral level or via intermediaries. In her article on the Himalayan Brotherhood, Blavatsky has some kinder words in describing Randolph. Again, while talking about the importance of contact with the masters. So she says that there was never a true initiate, but knew the secrets of the fraternities of the East. It was not Eliphas Levi who would deny their existence, since he had authentic signatures to the contrary. Even H.P.B. Randolph, that wondrous, exotic, erratic genius of America, half-initiated seer, who got his knowledge of the East, had good reasons to know of their existence, as his writings can prove. So examining the works of both of their works in the late 1860s, 1870s, it does seem that Blavatsky and Randolph were on the same mission. Among some of the other synchronicities and coincidences is their use of the word try, both as Randolph used it in his book plates and such, and the word try as it appears from the letters perpetually from the Brotherhood of Luxor. And both Blavatsky and Randolph were bent at this time on disproving the popular spiritism in the belief of the dead, meanwhile affirming psychic communications with masters or high spirits. Both wished to turn people's minds to occult science via the creation of spiritual brotherhoods. Finally, both promoted strength and equality of women. For Blavatsky, liberation of women was bound with celibacy and rising above the physical body. For Randolph, liberation of women came via sexual freedom, embracing their sexual identity and their sexual needs. He also promoted the use of hashish and other drugs to enhance clairvoyance. So this led to kind of inevitable accusations against him of black magic and phallicism. And these same sort of accusations with the sexual overtones was carried in to the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, which later had assumed Randolph's brand of Rosicrucianism and occultism. And the relationship between Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor and the Theosophy grew increasingly acrid in the 1880s as the group competed for members, and especially looking for members for a more practical approach to occultism. So as I'm going back to this slide, I want to show you as a bit higher. So this use of the word mono, of try, that both Randolph used here, and then it's also used in this letter from the Brotherhood of Luxor. And you can see large words of try, and the same sort of equilateral triangle or pyramid shape. Now, maybe the word try was just in vogue then, kind of like we would say, modern day time, we should say, yes, just do it. But it seems an odd coincidence. Going back to Blavatsky spoke about the Brotherhood of Luxor quite a bit in the early days as she was introducing Olcott to the idea of the masters and to her own brand of occultism. And it's through Olcott that we actually, in his writings, that we actually have some of the best insight into the Brotherhood of Luxor. So Olcott describes how the Brotherhood of Luxor became incorporated into the early presentation of the Theosophical Society in 1875. So he tells a story about how, he says about writing the circular, He says, I wrote every word of a circular myself. This is a circular promoting Theosophical Society. And alone corrected the printer's proofs and paid for the printing. That is to say, nobody dictated any of the words of what I should say, nor interpolated any of the words or sentences, or controlled my actions in any visible way. I wrote it to carry out the express wishes of the masters, and that we, HPB and I, should help the editor of the spiritualist science at what was to him a difficult crisis, and use a best judgment as to the language most suitable for the purpose. So when the circular was actually in type at the printers, and I'd corrected the proofs, and I changed the arrangement to the matter of the final paragraphs, I inquired of HPB by letter if she thought I had better issue it anonymously, or should I, use my own name? And she replied it was the wish of the masters that it should be signed thus: for the Committee of the Seven, Brotherhood of Luxor. And so it was signed and published. She subsequently explained that our work, and much more of the same kind, was being supervised by the Committee of the Seven Adepts belonging to the Egyptian group of the Universal Mystic Brotherhood. Up to this time, she had not even seen the circular, but now I took one to her myself, and she read it attentively. Presently, she laughed, and she told me to read the acrostic made by the initials of the 6 paragraphs. And to my amazement, I found out that it spelled out a name that I knew of the Egyptian adept under whose orders I was studying and working. And this would have been Serapis Bey, probably his last name of Tuit, or the name of his son Tuit. An Egyptian adept in whose works I was studying. And later I received a certificate written in gold and thick green paper to the effect that it was the observatory. Taft was the observatory of the 3 main masters under scrutiny. And we'll see an image of that later. So Olcott describes how initially his pupillage was attached to the Egyptian school, and only later was he transferred to the Indian. And from the above, it may be also that this African school was the school of Luxor. Okay. So here we've got, jump ahead. This is the manuscript he's talking about that he had received, and it has the signatures of the 3 masters, and of course this gold leaf, and written in gold on the thick paper, and from the observatory here. So on that list, and talking about the masters involved, Olcott goes on to list the 4 masters involved in his own study, that of a Copt, representative of the Neoplatonist school, a Venetian, whom he describes as the masters of masters, and an Egyptian philosopher who is thought to be dead but lives on. He adds that the Copt was his first guru, and Olcott notes that he, Blavatsky, and himself referred to the adepts as brothers in the early days. So let's go on a little bit and look at, this Council of 7 and the Brotherhood of Luxor, who they may be, starting with these 4 that Olcott names. So he talks about the Copt, which would be Serapis Bey or his son Tuit Bey. And it's this name Tuit that when he talks about the previous slide where he was talking about the name of the circular spelling out a name, it's pretty clear it was the Tuit from Tuit Bey. as his teacher. And Olcott received multiple letters from Serapis Bey and Tweed Babes during the early days between June and August of 1875. And these are also you often reference the Brotherhood of Luxor. And Serapis Bey, also figures heavily in the later work of Alice Bailey and other 20th century Ascended Master teachings, in which Serapis Bey is seen as the master of the fourth ray and is located in Egypt. The above signature, here we go, and here, so this lists Serapis Bey, Paleonius Cyranus, and Robert Moore. Now, Master Polonius Cyranus was the inspiration behind the works of Geoffrey Hobson. Now, as for Robert Moore, it's tempting to put him into who Olcott describes as an English philosopher, except that in his later diary, Olcott makes reference, instead of an English philosopher, he calls him an old Platonist who seemingly died to the world in September 1st, 1687. But actually, instead of dying, actually merely retired from public and lives on. The interesting thing, I did a web search for who died September 1st, 1687, and I come up with the Cambridge Platonist philosopher Henry Moore. Henry Moore is mentioned by Blavatsky in Isis Unveiled. So this kind of leaves it open. Is it really Robert someone else, or is it really a Henry Moore? Or is this Henry Moore? Olcott also describes two adepts visiting him in New York in 1875 to 1876. And these descriptions from Olcott are coming out of his old diary leaves, which is a really good source for some of this material. So one of these people who was visiting him, 1875, he describes as a dark-skinned man with a bushy beard, about 50, who spoke French and showed him visions in a crystal. The other was a young man whom Olcott had met in 1875, who he knew as Uten Liato. Now, Uten, he describes this younger man also as being a Cypriot. Now, Master Hilarion is often described, or Hilarion Symmetrius is often described as being a Cypriot. And this led some research, such as Jocelyn Godwin, to equate Uten Liato with Master Hilarion. But this would leave the older man as being unnamed. And, it is kind of odd that Olcott doesn't name either man as Hilarion, since in Blavatsky's stories, she reportedly, she was at some of these meetings, and she had reportedly met Hilarion in the flesh several years before in Egypt. So could it be that Serapis Bey, Tweed, Polydamas Sareras, Robert Moore, maybe Moore, Uten Liato, Hilarion are, could they be the Brotherhood of Luxor's Council of Seven? What of the most famous masters, Master Moira and Master Kahut Kumi? Of course, there also could be others, though, that just simply aren't recorded. Olcott compares, in looking back in his old diary leaves, he compares his own experience with the masters with that of spiritualist and psychic pioneer William Stainton Moses. And in talking about these, he says, he's talking about at this point, he talks about the idea of, am what I'm experiencing from the masters, is that the same as other people have experienced? And, where does this information come from? So comparing himself with SM here being Stainton Moses, he says that he thinks Olcott says that these all must come from the same source. And there's just a similarity that SM, Stainton Moses, he had his band of adepts, as I did. His adepts were likewise. I had my band also, though not really of spirit controls. SM had an Arabian teacher, so had I. He had an Italian professor, so had I. Italian philosopher, so had I. He had Egyptians, I had a Copt. He had Prudence, well-versed in Alexandrian and Indian lore. And so had I, several. He had Dr. D, the English mystic, and I had one who I've previously talked about as being the Platonists. So while Olcott noted the similarities of these possible master relationship with that of Stainton Moses and his own masters, there's also another contemporary. We talked about Randolph. There's another contemporary also receiving messages from the beyond, and that was that of Emma Harding Britton. Britton had most notably published Ghostland and Ars Magic in 1876. The later from her recipes and her speech at lectures in 1858-60. Britton was a clairvoyant who received most of her information from an entity she called Chevalier Louis. And what's interesting is that Ghostland, Britton's main work, Britton reveals how her teacher, this Chevalier Louis, was initiated into the Allure Brotherhood. And as we've seen previously in the previous letters from the masters, Serapis Bey identifies himself as being from the Allura section in his letters. And Serapis Bey is often referred to Blavatsky as being an Allurian. So we get these sort of similar ideas. Therefore, and of course, there's a cynical answer to this whole thing of the Brotherhood of Luxor. Rene Guion and later Paul Johnson felt that the Brotherhood of Luxor was just a loose name that Blavatsky gave to fellow travelers whom she met in Egypt and elsewhere. And possible members include Alex Rawson, who is also known to Randolph. And she met him in Cairo in 1871 and formed Soci Spirite. Paul Menton, Max Theon, who knew Blavatsky during her days in Egypt, and fellow travelers, Jamaldino Ghani, James Sauna, and even Alma Klumhum, who had cared for Blavatsky after her shipwreck before the two had a fallout. Now, Jocelyn Goodwin has another idea, and he proposed that the inspiration for the Brotherhood of Luxor might actually lie that the Brotherhood of Luxor, as a guiding force behind the early Theosophical Society, could rest with that of George Felt. And it was George Felt's lecture on the Egyptian architecture and geometry that inspired the beginnings of the Theosophical Society in 1875. George Felt thought that he had discovered the rudiments of Egyptian Kabbalah, and he wanted to use this to form a secret society. And he saw the early Theosophical Society as being one of opening up the ancient Egyptian mysteries. We put this together, and this may even have been behind the title for Blavatsky's opus of Isis Unveiled. And as such is a real testament, which is really a testament of the Brotherhood of Luxor. Thanks.